Michael Palin is no stranger to Melrose. He was here for the very first Borders Book Festival 6 years ago and is back here this year to promote his latest diaries, which are published in September and take you from 1980 through to 1988 and up to the very day prior to Michael setting off on his first epic travel journey 21 years ago when he went around the world in 80 days. I caught up with Michael earlier on and began by asking him about his journey to Melrose today. Well, Michael Palin, thank you very much for joining us here in one of the rooms in Harmony House, under the watchful eye of Sir Walter Scott as well, right in the very heart of Borders country. And nice to have you back in the Borders, first of all, back at the Book Festival.
Well, it's very, very nice to be here. It was a really magical time last time. I wasn't here for long, but I just remember this, it's a lovely part of the world, but the Abbey and the setting here is just kind of unforgettable. And I thought, well, yes, if I go to a festival this year, I'll go to Borders.
And of course, it's a few months before the second series in your collection of diaries is published, of course, 1980 to 1987. I think it comes out in September.
1980 to 88. It ends just the night before I start on my Around the World in 80-day journey, where I express serious doubts, but I say my life's never going to be the same again after this. So I was kind of right there. Yeah, the new volume of diaries comes out in September, yeah.
Now, you made your way up to the Borders, or part of your way here, on train, of course. I think you got off at Berwick and then drove across. Memories back to an early travel experience for television. I'm thinking back to a few pages right at the very end of your last book of diaries, back to 1979, 1980, and the great railway journey, which took you really through the heart of Britain.
That's right. I was asked to do this. I was the last contributor asked to join the Great Railway Journey series. And I must say, when they asked me, I did have visions of going through Peru or up the Himalayas or through the Rockies. And they said, no, they've all been taken. You're doing London to Crewe. But it turned out to be Crewe, and in fact we went up then through up to the Kyle of Lochalsh. So for someone like myself who loves railways, it was a comprehensive look at the railways of Britain. And of course, you come up here and someone like Berwick with the Royal Border Bridge and the railway bridge there, it's a fantastic bit of engineering. And I remember going through Berwick and I think I said, trotted out the familiar observation that it still hasn't signed a peace treaty with Russia after the 1918 war. Is that true?
I think that has now been settled. I'm nodding, but I think I'm not terribly confident, but I do believe it has now been settled. Put to rest.
It's a pity that they settled it, because I think it must have been very good for tourism in Berwick.
It's certainly that and Lowry. I think the two of them, very different, obviously, attractions, but I think both had impact.
It's a great part of the world. And I was born and brought up in Sheffield, so to me, houses and walls should be of stone, not of brick. And of course, they are stone up here, and they're splendid. So I feel very much at home here.
When you were travelling back in 1980, making that programme for the television series, in the back of your mind, did you ever think, in a few years' time, I wouldn't mind, I'd quite like to follow in the footsteps of someone like Alan Wicker. I'd like to take on a challenge like this. I mean, 8 years then passed, and then you were presented with a life-changing experience. But did you ever think back in 1980 it could possibly happen to you?
I don't think I really did expect that I would become, at any time in my life, a serious documentary maker. At that time, almost everything I was involved in was comedy. We'd done Python, we'd done The Ripping Yarns, we'd done The Life of Brian. In 1980, I was also involved with Time Bandits with Terry Gilliam and a new Python film. So, everything was writing and performing comedy. And then into the middle of this, as I say, comes the Great Railway Journey. And I had to persuade an American financier who had hired me to do Terry Gilliam's film that I really wanted to do this railway documentary for 3 weeks. And he said, well, I'll get you the biggest fee the BBC have ever paid. And he couldn't. He couldn't get this lady called Betty in BBC contracts to pay more than, £2,500 for everything. Yeah. 3 weeks' work. And he couldn't believe that. He said, Michael, you really want to do this? And I said, yeah, I love trains and I love the country and I want to do it. So I did it. And oddly enough, 8 years later, having seen me do this documentary, a man called Clem Valance, who'd had the original idea for Around the World in 80 Days, said, I've seen Michael Palin do documentaries. He can do a serious documentary. He's not a complete clown. I think I'll ask him if he wants to go around the world in 80 days. And he asked me, and I suppose that although I never really thought of myself as being another Wicker, I mean, Wicker did what he did brilliantly, but I love travel. And so I was extremely tempted when someone said, we will pay for you to go around the world. So
look to essentially put your own spin on it.
Yes.
Your own mark on it.
There was no real plan. He just chose me, and I think he had confidence that I would make something out of this. But there was no script. We just set off, and I was quite nervous to start with. I thought, what on earth, what am I going to say to camera? How am I going to present this? And really the point was that we decided to let everything be shown. So if I was making a complete fool of myself, getting the language wrong, or I was going spare trying to buy a railway ticket somewhere in Egypt, or I got ill on the Dow, on the Persian Gulf, keep the camera running and let me deal with it. And that's what people, I think, seemed to like in the end, that I was not an expert, clearly. I was more like an everyman, travelling the way most people thought they'd travel. And that style just was developed almost accidentally through that programme.
Essentially then, filming and including in the final programme common, almost everyday travel experiences, realistic travel experiences.
Yes. I mean, if you're feeling ill, say you're feeling ill. If you're getting hot, show yourself getting hot. Don't sort of pretend, don't have a makeup caravan there or someone to sort of tidy you up all the time. Let's see what it really is like when you're on the ground. And those parts of what we shot worked better than the sit-down interviews with heads of tourist boards or politicians or things like that. We got rid of those and just made it really a series of encounters with people you meet along the way. And it depended on a particular skill in the camera work. And I had two very, very good cameramen on that, both called Nigel Meek and Nigel Walters. And they were able to just capture moments. And there's quite a skill to that. You've got to be very fluid. You've got to be very sort of aware of what's happening and knowing you've only got one chance to get an interview at one time. It's not a controlled environment. It's changing all the time.
And in a sense, I suppose then, your own personal diaries would then completely change, take a completely different, they'd have a completely different look to them, essentially, because you're on the road for such a long period of time. Yes.
Well, the BBC asked me to do a book to accompany the series. And I thought of, again, I'll keep a few notes. And when I get home, I'll sort of make... I'll put these together into a travel book, the way you see Colin Thubron or Paul Theroux doing. And then I thought, actually, what is immediate about the little notebooks is the day at the top, the fact there's a wine stain or a coffee stain on one page. Make the book the diaries. And so I started publishing diaries of journeys from 80 days right through to the last one, New Europe. But it was only about 3 years ago that I actually published my own personal diaries of which I kept apart from the travel times, just of life generally. So it was a lot about.
And how difficult was that to edit down? Because I'd imagine things like holidays, for instance, you always take out holidays, for example, and keep in other day-to-day events and little records of how much a loaf of bread cost in 1973, maybe not necessarily terribly relevant at the time, but 25, 30 years later, it's interesting to look at the comparison.
Yes, I mean, I tried to, with the edit, balance out Python stories. Clearly what people were most interested in would be the Python filming, but I also wanted to show my own sort of life alongside that. So a lot was about our growing family. When I started doing Monty Python, I had a son who was not yet a year old. And by the end of the 80s, we had, by the end of the 70s, we had 3 children. That's important. Yeah, what was going on in the world, the fact that there was a great deal of sort of, in these days we think we're in an insecure world. At that time, the fear of nuclear destruction, how serious that was, IRA terrorism, all those sort of things just going on. And as you say, things like the price of a loaf of bread or the fact that milk still came in bottles rather than cartons, little things like that I wanted to keep in. So I just tried to keep a sort of, it was like a sort of patchwork of the period, little bits of everything. But the main thrust of the story was my growing family and my working family, which was the Python.